Hello, Ray. Remember me?
How are you?
Call me KC.
Casey, I'm Ray. Nice to meet you.
You too.
We're giving out these DVDs. Okay, they're free.
Alright.
Inside and see what the issues are.
Well, I suppose I should start by apologizing for sabotaging your efforts to poison the minds of the students at Hollywood High School. That was a bit rude of me, making you waste you and your thugs' morning like that, but I maintain that my actions were fully justified, and to explain why this is so, let me tell you a little story. Once upon a time, when I was also a young, impressionable high school student, I was the victim of someone just like you. I was quite clever, being one of the top students of my class, but I was also very gullible and naive. Most young people are. And while I am still quite young and much more naive and far less cynical than I will be in the future, I'm also not stupid. I never was, but I was once gullible enough to believe stupid things. You see, a few years ago, I was walking to school on a morning much like the one in which you decided to hand out your pseudoscientific documentary, when a stranger much like yourself handed me a free DVD. The title of that DVD was Loose Change, and the content of that video changed my life forever. It's amazing how easily anyone can take a phenomenon, spin the science to meet whatever agenda needs to be met, and convince anyone who doesn't understand how science works that a legitimate case is being presented. By the end of that day, I was absolutely convinced that the United States government had orchestrated the events of September 11 by flying drones into skyscrapers, bringing the buildings down with bombs, firing a missile at the Pentagon, and blowing up a ditch in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Though I had no knowledge of physics or engineering, I thought that watching a documentary that pointed out all the alleged problems with 9/11 was sufficient to justify my becoming a 9/11 truther. I preached the truth of government conspiracy to anyone who would listen, and I basked in the subsequent negative attention that I received because I was a martyr in the name of truth and patriotism. I wrote a 40-page essay for a research project in my English class that detailed the truth about 9/11. The 9/11 conspiracy was all that I ever talked about, and the toll that my obsession took on my relationships with family and friends was made bearable by the thought that I was sacrificing myself for the greater good. For 2 years, I indulged in my delusions of self-importance and the complimentary overconfidence in my abilities. It wasn't until after I learned how science actually operated that I began to have my doubts, and it wasn't until I started to study real science seriously and objectively that I cut all ties with my flawed beliefs. It was a difficult and painful time, but I grew from the experience, and it was that experience that motivated me to destroy your plans. Whenever I argue with a creationist, I see a bit of my younger self in my opponent, and I hate it. I hate the arrogance and dishonesty of creationism. I hate the never-ending evasive maneuvers and the constant goalpost shifting and non sequiturs that creationists routinely employ. I hate the pretentious pontifications of creationists on matters in which they have no understanding or formal training. I hate being reminded of what I used to be. But most of all, Ray, I hate the people who created us. I hate the people like you who gave us those DVDs on our way to school. The people like you who make their children attend creationist seminars. The people like you who explicitly aim your filth at the youth. There's a reason why you distributed your DVDs to teenagers instead of a committee of scientists. It's the same reason why you and your fellow creationists target the young and impressionable instead of the aged and the scholarly. And it's the same reason that creationists use dinosaurs the same way that pedophiles use candy. Because you, Ray, are a predator. Not a sexual predator, but a psychological one. You prey on the young and the weak because you know that they're too trusting, too dependent, and too innocent to believe that a man with a soft voice and a gentle smile would ever want to exploit them to further his monetary and political interests. And that's why I had to stop you, Ray. My efforts to counteract your poison came not from my hatred of you, nor of your agenda, nor even of your insidious messages of willful ignorance and abject conformity. My motivation wasn't hatred, Ray. It was empathy for the teenagers who would have become your latest victims. By now, Ray, many YouTubers have addressed your documentary, so I will not reiterate many of the technical points that you've already heard. I will not waste time explaining why the explosion of nothing into everything has nothing to do with evolution, nor why the assembly of arose from nothing is an irrelevance to the theory, nor why evolution has nothing to do with atheism or Christianity. Instead, I will focus on your failure to understand how science actually operates and what evolutionary theory actually predicts, and I will subsequently compare the real science to the lame caricature that you've crafted. My rebuttal to evolution versus God comes in 3 tiers: how science actually operates, observable and testable evidence for evolution, and all kinds of BS. So now that we've dispensed with the preliminaries, Mr. Comfort, let's proceed with the evisceration of your sad excuse for a documentary. You know, I find it amazing that after so many years of countering creationist crap, we still have to explain the scientific method to them. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack and explain how the philosophies that underlie science are in conflict, or at the very least are disregarded by, Ray Comfort and his ilk. What needs to be understood from the outset is that the goal of science is not to discover truth, which for the purposes of this video will be defined as absolutely accurate information. The goal of science is to create models that have predictive power. As far as the world that we perceive is concerned, we do not know, and moreover we cannot know, for absolute certain whether a reality external to ourselves exists. What we do know is that we experience sensory inputs, and it would thus far appear that manipulating the observable universe yields consistent sensory information. What's more, different algorithms of manipulating the environment yield different sensory inputs. Touch a hot stove and you'll experience pain. Stop breathing and you'll pass out. This seemingly obvious principle forms the basis of the scientific method. By manipulating variables A, B, and C, we experience sensory stimuli X, Y, and Z. In other words, observation and experimentation can allow us to find patterns in the world, and we can use these patterns to make predictions about future data. However, there still remains, and will always remain, an insurmountable epistemic barrier between what we perceive and what is absolutely real. It is for this reason that nothing in science can be proven. Nothing about the physical world can be known for absolute certain because science operates inductively via description rather than definition. That's why when you said in your documentary that evolution is unscientific because it can't be proven, you were speaking gibberish. The scientific method does not concern itself with proofs, for which there is no formal scientific standard, only with the construction of predictive models based on patterns in nature. By contrast, mathematics does concern itself with proofs because it is entirely definitional and therefore deductive in nature. In math, you begin with a series of axioms that guide the behavior of a set of elements. As these axioms are explored and combined in formalized proofs, new axioms emerge and can be further combined in various ways until you have an entire network of interconnected axioms, all stacked one on top of each other, with the first principles at the bottom of this metaphorical pyramid. But how do we know that these first principles are true? How do we know that 2 + 2 really equals 4, or that a triangle always has 3 sides? Because these first principles are definitional. In the same way that you can't have a married bachelor or an empty room that's full of people, the definitions inherent to these elements cannot be contradicted. This can be a subtle and difficult concept to grasp, but as has been quite rightly pointed out in the past, the rules guiding mathematics are no less arbitrary than the ones guiding poker, hopscotch, or chess. As it happens, though, math is a more convenient deductive framework to use when describing observable reality than the rules of chess are. So now that we're more familiar with the roles played by science and mathematics, we can get to exactly why Ray Comfort misunderstands the scientific method when he goes around asking for observable evidence for evolutionary theory, and then rejects what he is given on the grounds that what's being presented is, quote, unobservable. As your documentary pointed out, science is founded on observation and experimentation, but it is staggeringly naive to believe that observation and experimentation of a particular phenomenon is the only way to vindicate it scientifically. This is not the case. It is possible to understand a phenomenon by examining the evidence pertaining to it rather than witnessing the phenomenon itself, and in any case, observation and experimentation are not the sole functions of the scientific enterprise. Merely observing a falling object isn't science. Merely experimenting with falling objects by dropping them from different heights and through different media, and subsequently recording the data, is also insufficient to qualify as science. But being able to use your observations and the results of your experiments to make predictions about future data, now that's what science is all about. Science isn't merely a repository of facts, but is the process of creating theories. As I've already mentioned, we observe patterns in the universe, and we can use these patterns to make predictions. If a theory is an accurate representation of how observable reality behaves, then by manipulating variables A, B, and C, we can expect to observe X, Y, and Z. But contrary to what you seem to think, Ray, the direct observation of a particular phenomenon is unnecessary to vindicate the validity of the phenomenon. You don't need to observe, for example, a hyena-like creature giving birth to a whale to be able to know that modern whales descended from hyena-like creatures. And to understand why this is, let's explore some other avenues of science that I'm confident you accept before we proceed to see why evolutionary theory meets the same exact standards as those other sciences. Consider the dwarf planet Pluto, which was discovered only 80 years ago. It has an orbit period of 248 years, so how do we know that Pluto is orbiting the Sun if we've never seen it complete an orbit? Moreover, how do we know what trajectory it takes if we've never seen it make a complete cycle? Did the scientists just accept on faith that this is how Pluto moves? Of course not. By measuring its motion and distance and plugging in the values to the equations that guide orbital mechanics, not only did we learn how Pluto moves, but we have the ability to determine, for example, where in space Pluto was 1,000 years ago, and where exactly we should expect to find it 1,000 years from now. If the theory regarding Pluto's orbit is accurate, then when we manipulate variables A, B, and C, we should experience sensory stimuli X, Y, and Z. Though we've never seen Pluto complete its orbit, it has successfully conformed to every prediction involving its motion through space, and so we have very good reason to believe that Pluto's motion conforms to Newton's and Kepler's laws, as well as Einstein's relativistic corrections. Another such example is that of the existence of protons. No one has ever observed an individual proton, so how do we know that they exist? And moreover, how is it that we know their size to such a high degree of accuracy? Well, at the time of the proton's discovery, it was believed that the atom was a series of negatively charged electrons surrounding by the positively charged analog of pudding, which inspired this model's name. It had been suggested, however, that a particle acting as the positive equivalent of electrons was present in the atom, rather than just an atomic background saturated with positive charge. In the early 1900s, Ernest Rutherford experimented with alpha particles and gold foil to determine the nature of atoms. Alpha particles have a positive charge, and so firing them at the gold foil should yield very telling results. If the atom was a mess of electrons surrounded by a background that countered their charge, then the alpha particles should pass through the foil without incident. However, if there existed a positive analog of electrons within the atom, the positive charge of the alpha particles should cause them to be deflected when they come close to that positive particle, thereafter referred to as the proton. And this is exactly what Rutherford witnessed. Occasionally, an alpha particle would fly away from the gold foil after being fired at it, sometimes at a 180-degree angle. And based on the statistical distribution of the trajectories of the alpha particles, physicists were able to determine the size and magnitude of the charge of the proton, as well as its relative location within the atom. Let's consider one more example. In 1859, it was discovered that Mercury's orbit did not conform perfectly to Newton's theory of gravity. There were unresolved anomalies pertaining to the planet's precession, and try as scientists might to account for the discrepancies between theory and observation, no conclusive resolution was forthcoming. Enter Einstein and his theory of general relativity, which proposes that the force of gravity is not so much a phenomenon that pulls masses inward as it is a consequence of space and time being curved. Space and time were once considered abstract mathematical externalities with no physical basis, but general relativity proposes that these are very much physical phenomena and that they could be distorted, affecting mass and energy as they do so in the same way that bending and twisting a canvas can change the painting that's colored on it. A number of predictions were subsequently associated with Einstein's theory. If space and time really can be distorted by mass, then we should see the effect of that distortion when we study large masses. During an eclipse, we should see light bend in accordance with the equations pertaining to Einstein's theory. If his theory is correct, we should see the lensing of light in deep space around massive objects. And if his theory is correct, then the mathematical corrections that it makes to Mercury's orbit should be concordant with observation. In all three and countless other cases, Einstein's theory has been vindicated time and again. We have never witnessed space-time itself, much less its curvature, but every prediction involving this proposed phenomenon has thus far been vindicated, making Einstein one of the greatest scientists in history. The point that I wanted to illustrate with the curvature of space-time, the nature of protons, and the orbit of Pluto is that though none of these things have ever been observed, the evidence relevant to these phenomena is observable. We can use that evidence as well as patterns in nature to try to predict any future data pertaining to these cases, which is what science is really all about. I can name countless more examples, but I think that my point is made. So now that we have a clearer picture of how science actually operates, let's take a look at the observable evidence for evolution. Give me something I can see, observe, and test for Darwinian evolution. Those were your words in Evolution versus God, Ray, and now I shall oblige you. If humans and other species of primate came from a common ancestor, we should find evidence of this in our DNA. First, let's take a step back and consider evolution from the perspective of Darwin. He proposed a metaphorical tree of life whose branches were defined by the Linnaean taxonomic classification scheme. That is, the familial relationships between life forms were organized around their morphologies. Darwin published Origins almost a century before the discovery of DNA, which was later used as one of the primary bases for classifying organisms in what's now known as phylogenetics. If evolutionary theory is correct, then when we compare Linnaean hierarchies to genetic ones, we should expect a significant overlap. And this is exactly what we find. DNA cross-confirms Linnaean taxonomy more than 80% of the time. In other words, DNA tells the same story as Darwin's tree of life. DNA is also incredibly useful for determining various aspects of populations. For example, the Hardy-Weinberg equation, which serves as the basis for paternity tests, can be used along with distinct gene markers to calculate when life forms diverged. We can use the mathematical models brought to us by differential equations and apply them to DNA to determine that Europeans broke off from Africans 50,000 years ago, that the Homo genus broke off from other primates 6 million years ago, etc., etc., etc. Next, consider the chronological order of organisms in the fossil record. If evolutionary theory is correct, then we should find that their placement in history corresponds to the mathematical extrapolations involving DNA, and that both of these chronological hierarchies should correspond to the aforementioned morphological and genetic family trees. And guess what? That's exactly what we find. Why is it, Ray, that every avenue of biological categorization consistently points to evolution from a common ancestor? When I asked you at Hollywood High School why the morphology, chronological order, and DNA of organisms cross-confirm each other and form the same hierarchies that Darwin had envisioned, this was your answer.
It's because God made them like that.
Whether a god was responsible for evolutionary development is beside the point. The only mathematical models that are able to account for the overlap of different taxonomic trees are evolutionary algorithms. Evolutionary theory not only is sublime in that it accurately tells us what we should expect to find, but also in that it tells us what we shouldn't expect to find. In your documentary, you seem to think that a vestigial structure is one that serves no purpose, but you are wrong. A vestige is a structure whose function has changed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be useless. It's also useful to define the related term atavism, which refers to the reappearance of a characteristic unique to an organism's ancestor. The relevance of atavisms and vestiges to evolutionary theory is that if we all came from a common ancestor, our DNA should have metaphorical extra baggage from our ancestors, and that should be expressed both molecularly and morphologically. Moreover, the extra baggage can belong only to the lineage of the organism in question. We expect to occasionally find semi-functional tails in humans, remnants of teeth in birds, and hind fins on dolphins as extra baggage from their ancestors, but we also expect to never find bones or their remnants in invertebrates, cellulose in animal cells, or memories on amphibians because these features are not found in any organisms in these examples' respective ancestries. The fact that atavisms and vestiges fulfill this prediction with zero contradictions with any of the hierarchies that I've already mentioned serves as extremely powerful evidence that all organisms descended from a common ancestor. In fact, evolution is the only theory capable of explaining psychological atavisms and vestiges. One example of such is of human infants instinctively knowing how to float when placed in water before losing this ability after a few weeks, and another is of the ability of over a third of all infants to use the palmar grasp reflex to support their own body weights with their hands and feet, which is a feature prevalent in juvenile members of other species of primates that is used to keep the baby latched onto the mother. Because there are no grip points on a human female for her baby, this reflex is vestigial, and like the aforementioned flotation reflex, it generally disappears in a matter of weeks. Again, only evolutionary theory is capable of explaining the existence of this extra baggage. Yet another prediction that evolution has accurately made concerns indigenous retroviruses, which can be regarded as vestiges at the molecular level. When a virus enters a germ cell belonging to the host, its genetic material becomes permanently integrated with its host's DNA, and since DNA is passed on to the next generation of organisms, the ERV also gets passed on. If all organisms came from a common ancestor, then the distribution of ERVs in the genomes should reflect that. In other words, a typically 500 base pair long ERV within the 3 million base pair long human genome must be identical both in sequence and location to an ERV found in other species of primates. Evolution is the only probable candidate for the existence of shared ERVs because the odds that a single ERV integrated itself into an identical location in two different organisms is approximately 1 in 3 billion. If evolutionary theory is correct, then we should expect to find at least one common ERV between humans and chimps. As it happens, we share about a dozen identically placed and identically sequenced ERVs with chimps. In addition to this, studies of ERVs and other genomes have yielded statistical distributions of ERV parallels that allow us to categorize organisms by maximizing the number of shared ERVs and minimizing the number of differing ones. The end result is a phylogeny that is based exclusively on ERVs and, you guessed it, it cross-confirms the aforementioned two chronological hierarchies and the two structural hierarchies. Finally, we get to one of the most famous pieces of genetic evidence for common ancestry between humans and other great apes. All of the great apes that are not human possess 24 pairs of chromosomes, but humans have only 23 pairs. If evolutionary theory is accurate, then the common ancestor to all great apes had either 23 pairs of chromosomes or 24 pairs. If the former is correct, then the ancestors unique to the other great apes must have had one of their chromosome pairs divide into two independent pairs of chromosomes. And if the latter is correct, then the ancestors unique to modern humans must have had two pairs of their chromosomes fuse into one larger pair. In either case, there would be signs that such an event had taken place, and if evolutionary theory is accurate, then we should expect to find those signs. As it happens, scientists did. The precise location of the fusion site on chromosome 2 was located in mid-2006, successfully vindicating yet another prediction of evolutionary theory. This was an extremely short list of observable and testable evidence for evolution that comes only from genetics. Other evidence strictly from the field of genetics and biochemistry would include non-ERV molecular vestiges, molecular convergence, and the role of gene duplication in adding new nucleotide combinations to DNA. This is without going into the mountains of other evidence that include thousands of discovered transitional forms, dozens of witnessed speciation events, and the perfectly consistent geological record. This perfect geological record is filled with a large number of very simple predictions, and I'll list just a few of them here. If evolutionary theory is accurate, the following predictions will hold. You will never find avians in sediment older than the Jurassic. You will never find amphibians in sediment older than the Devonian. You will never find primates in sediment older than the Cretaceous. You will find only aquatic life in sediment older than the Silurian. And you will never find a fossil bunny in the Precambrian. So there you have it, Ray. Observable, testable evidence for evolutionary theory. All of these predictions are exclusive to evolutionary theory, and the only viable rebuttal that you've shown yourself to be capable of is this one.
It's because God made them like that.
Unfortunately, taking this route requires you to not just throw Occam's razor away, but would be the equivalent of embedding it in a stick of dynamite, flushing it down the toilet, and blowing open the sewers, which would actually go a long way to explain the smell. But we already know that you won't accept any of this evidence, Ray, because none of it involves the observation of, quote, one kind turning into another kind, end quote. Of course, the fact that the evidence that I've presented meets the same criteria as the evidence for the curvature of space, the nature of protons, and Pluto's orbit presents a bit of a problem for you, so in your desperation, I suspect that you will try to pull your last card. That card involves all kinds of BS. When I talked to you at Hollywood High School, Ray, I gave you the aforementioned piece of evidence for evolution regarding the consistent corroboration of Linnaean taxonomic trees with genetic and chronological ones. Now, just so that we have some perspective on your position, Ray, you claim to have the ability to refute 150 years worth of data from fields as diverse as biochemistry, paleontology, nuclear physics, and genetics, yet you did not know what phylogeny or Linnaean taxonomy are or why they're critical to the theory of evolution. In fact, when we were talking about Carolus Linnaeus, you asked me if he believed in kinds, presumably because he was a creationist who was born 100 years before Darwin. Unfortunately for you, however, Linnaeus was the one who invented the classification scheme of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, and it is that classification scheme that I will be using for the remainder of this segment. I mention your ignorance of these topics not to score a cheap shot, Ray, but to outline your monumental arrogance. If you don't know how to use a voltmeter, you don't tell an electrician how to do his job. If you don't know how to change a pipe, you don't tell a plumber how to do his job. If you don't know how to safely use pesticides, you don't tell an exterminator how to do his job. If you don't know anything about lighting or focus, you don't tell a photographer how to do his job. And if you don't know anything about science, Ray, you don't tell scientists how to do their jobs. In your video, you demanded observable evidence of one kind turning into another kind. As this was the central point of your documentary, all that I need to do to disprove your entire film is to demonstrate that your demand is incoherent. We need to address the issue of kind once and for all. I quote the following statement from you verbatim, Ray. Quote, "Darwin spoke of a change in kinds," end quote. But of course he never did. This was a bald-faced lie. What Darwin did describe was the divergence of Linnaean ranks, but at no point did he use the word that you seem to adore. I realize that polysyllabic words and their definitions may be difficult for creationists to grasp, Ray, but that's no excuse to throw 3 centuries of biology out the window and opt to use a word with no taxonomic correspondence. You may protest that it's unreasonable to ask you to present an objective taxonomy for kinds, Ray, but you would be wrong. Every discipline in science has some form of taxonomy, some objective set of criteria that has to be met in order to classify the units of information that are being studied. This is done to eliminate ambiguity and to find relationships, because as we've established earlier, finding patterns in nature is critical to the scientific method, and vague definitions leave the door open to equivocation and goalpost shifting. That is unacceptable. In chemistry, atoms are identified by the number of protons that they have, and their corresponding ions and isotopes are identified by their electrical charge and the number of neutrons that they have, respectively. In quantum mechanics, subatomic particles are identified by the values of their spin, rest mass, charge, and composition if they're not elementary. In geology, rocks are divided into 3 main categories based on some general properties, and are individually identified by color, mineral composition, size, grain orientation, hardness, density, reaction to acids, streak, chemical composition, and even taste. In biology, organisms are generally classified according to DNA and morphology. In these and many other cases, the differences between the subjects of study and the criteria that they must meet to obtain a specific classification are made essentially unambiguous. So with all of this in mind, Ray, what does a person need to look for when they're trying to distinguish between kinds? When I talked to you at Hollywood High School, I asked you what a kind was. You did not answer me. You only gave me examples, but you did not lay out a clear and concise definition.
How do we define kinds, though? I mean, it seems like a really vague term.
Well, it's very, very clear. You've got the canine kind, coyote, and the domestic dog. You've got the feline kind, the cat, and the tiger, and you've got human kind. It's very, very clear.
Ironically, the way that you categorize these organisms makes it possible for me to show, using your standards, that humans are the same kind as chimpanzees and gorillas. First, you named the canine kind, in which you included coyotes and domestic dogs. They both belong to the same genus, which is Canis. So far, it looks like if 2 animals belong to the same genus, they're the same kind. Okay. Next, you brought up the feline kind, which you said included cats and tigers. While cats and tigers aren't part of the same genus, they are part of the same family, which is Felidae. So now it looks like in order for two organisms to be the same kind, they must belong to the same Linnaean family. Good. Then you named humankind. Humans, or Homo sapiens, are a single species, but since we've established that a kind includes members of the same Linnaean family, then I can also say that orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees are the same kind as humans, since they all belong to the family Hominidae. Bear in mind, Ray, that I was using your standard for what counts as the same kind. And if you'd like to accuse me of using a classification system that has an evolutionary bias, then at the risk of sounding repetitive, I would ask you to please take note that Linnaean taxonomy was established by a Christian creationist 100 years before Darwin published Origins, and has been extensively cross-confirmed by DNA and the chronological order of organisms in both the genetic and geological records. The problem gets even worse when we look at your documentary, specifically when P.Z. Myers gives you an example of a speciation event within bacteria. You seem to think that it was funny that his example of a change in kinds was of a bacteria producing a different kind of bacteria, but was still bacteria. Based on your attitude in the context of this exchange, I think that we can safely conclude that you believe that bacteria is its own kind. What you didn't seem to realize is that this argument results in a monumental failure for your position, because two different species of bacteria don't just belong to the same genus, family, or class. It's much worse than that. Not only do they belong to the same phylum and kingdom, but two unspecified samples of bacteria must, by definition, belong to the same domain, which is prokaryota. By saying that bacteria is its own kind, you've extended the definition of kind to include an entire domain of organisms. To see why this is so problematic for your position, let's take a look at the domain eukaryota. By using this new standard of kind that you've implicitly established, I can say that humans, jellyfish, ants, mushrooms, snakes, pigs, roses, donkeys, sharks, bees, and marijuana are all the same kind. And I can say this, as I will remind you, using your definition of kind. Do you see now, Ray, why using such vague language in science is unacceptable? Still, during our exchange at Hollywood High School, I persevered. I wanted you to give me an objective method that I could use to distinguish between kinds, and then you said this.
It's very, very clear.
Right, but how do you differentiate between them? What's the scheme?
Don't have to, because you've got the Chihuahua and you've got the Great Dane. They're dogs, they're canines.
That's right, Ray. There is no way to objectively distinguish between one kind of animal and another. So tell me, Ray, how on earth is anyone supposed to know what would count as one kind turning into another kind if you don't even know how to tell them apart? And on the rare occasions that you actually do decide to give us an example of what counts as a kind, you're extremely inconsistent. In the example that you just gave me, Chihuahuas and Great Danes both belong to the same subspecies, Canis lupus familiaris. That being the case, we can define a kind as a subspecies. Well, as I'm sure you already know, not only have we seen subspecies producing new subspecies, which is microevolution, we've witnessed no fewer than 30 speciation events, vis-a-vis macroevolution. But you always dismiss these examples, claiming that they belong to the same kind, and then you shift the goalpost to the next taxonomic level. This never-ending game would almost be comical if it weren't so blatantly dishonest of you. I mean, come on, Ray. You've spanned the entire Linnaean ladder simply by shifting the goalposts of what would count as a change in kinds. And by playing this pathetic little word game of yours, you can dodge the evidence for evolution forever. The only evidence that would ever satisfy you, Ray, is evidence of things that you know isn't predicted by evolutionary theory, like cats giving birth to crocoducks. So in summation, Ray, the reason that no one has ever been able to show you a satisfactory example of a change in kinds is because you don't know what a kind is, and you refuse to provide an objective criteria to help us define and distinguish between them. Come on, Ray, at what point do two organisms cease to be the same kind? What's the threshold? Is it a certain number or percentage of morphological differences? A certain number or percentage of genetic differences? Or is a kind more likely whatever it needs to be in order to allow you to shift the goalposts indefinitely? As I've just shown, Ray, when words mean whatever they need to at the time that you're telling a particular lie, you sacrifice consistency, and as a result the definition of kind can range from subspecies to domain. It's clear from your attitude, your pretensions to moral and intellectual superiority over the men and women who are sincerely passionate about the subjects on which you pontificate, and your willful ignorance of even the most cursory aspects of evolutionary theory, that evolution versus God is just an overhyped, emotionally manipulative, and unintelligible conglomeration of dishonesty and stupidity. It was clearly meant for an unsophisticated audience who have either already been indoctrinated into your malodorous flavor of religious extremism, or have only the most basic understanding of science, and it is for that reason that minors are, as with every other creationist presentation, the ideal targets for your video. Look at those children, Ray. Watch as they're injected with the pseudo-intellectual poison that you and your contemporaries have wrought.
If you've heard that dinosaurs lived millions of years ago, dear oh dear.
So we're going to have to take that out. We certainly don't want that in our textbook. Okay, we need to take that out of the textbook because we don't want that in our textbook, do we? No way. So what do we need to do about dinosaurs being millions of years old? We need to take that out of there, yeah. So what should we do with that? We need to take that out of the textbook. What are we going to do about this, guys? We need to take it out. Yeah, let's get rid of that. So what do we need to do about that? We need to take that one out of the books, don't we? You kids are liking this, aren't you? Ripping up the textbooks.
Is there anything more perverted or obscene than tainting the most vulnerable of us in such a repugnant manner? Did I have any choice other than to stop you from molesting their minds, as mine had once been? And do you think that they will thank you, Ray? They will be laughed at and ridiculed by those who know better. They will be pitied and lamented for by the enlightened children who they keep company with. They will become ignorant and bitter, deprived of the knowledge possessed by their peers, and the only solace that they will gain will be through the mental masochism of your particular flavor of religious extremism. These children will grow up to be cold and empty slaves of their parents' nightmares, forever chained by the ignorance that you and your ilk force-feed them, always tormented by the ghosts of the intelligent and informed lives that they might have led had you and others like you not stood in their way. Do you think that they will thank you for imbuing them with ignorance, Ray? Do you think that they will thank the man who taught them it was glorious?